Historians, marine biologists, and cryptozoologists of Reddit. As far as legends in history go, what legendary creature do you believe may have been real and probably existed in some way, or what supposedly legendary person in history was more than likely real? Story 1. Related. Some of the earlier vampire myths talk about them having an insanely strong lust for women, and vampires would break in and sleep with them with or without the bloodsucking. It was generally a woman they fancied in life, like a husband looking for his wife or a secret admirer looking for his crush, although some stories suggested they were strangers. It's believed that these were basically cover stories for some affairs. An adulterous couple would do their thing, then when signs of the entry and fun times are discovered, the woman could cover it up with, vertilac? The townspeople would all be like, oh shit, we gotta protect this poor vampire victim, instead of thinking she was cheating. Didn't help that any sightings of the vampire would be a man in a dark cloak in the dead of night. So they'd lock the doors and all that, woman let the guy in, they'd go again, and in the morning she'd need to have an explanation. He hypnotized me to open the door? They'd be like, holy shit, Vertilex can hypnotize people? It took off from there. Story 2. The Wendigo probably existed, just not as a creature. People in the far north who survived a brutal winter by eating a family member had a psychological escape hatch for the guilt and horror by convincing themselves they were transforming into a ravenous, murderous beast. They'd continue killing and eating in a hysteric delusion that they had no control over it. Wendigo hunters would then have to come and kill them and perform a shamanic ritual to assure the rest of the tribe that the taint wouldn't spread. It's actually an incredibly fascinating study into culturally specific mental illness. The lengths the mind will go to in order to avoid dealing with a traumatic event are so extraordinary that in the culture they would actually continue to murder and cannibalize fellow tribe members under the delusion they had transformed into a monster. Story 3. The Maori people of New Zealand have long told stories of the puakai, a monstrous bird that was big enough to hunt and eat humans. Many believe that these stories are referring to the Haast's eagle. It was the largest species of eagle ever to have lived on Earth, with weights of around 30 pounds and wingspans almost reaching 10 feet. It lived on New Zealand's South Island and primarily hunted the flightless moa bird, which weighed around 500 pounds. Given the large size of its main prey, it's likely that the eagle may have also targeted lone humans as well. Interestingly enough, the Haast's eagle went extinct around the year 1400, not long after the Maori arrived in New Zealand. It's thought that its extinction can be attributed to habitat destruction combined with the extinction of the moa due to hunting with the Maori. Story 4. The mythical unicorn likely derives from travelers from Africa or Asia to Europe trying to describe a rhinoceros. There are Asian rhinos in India, Nepal, and Indonesia. When you consider that ancient Greek depictions of lions sometimes looked more like dogs and that the word hippopotamus comes from Greek word meaning river horse, it is easy to see how a Greek traveler would describe a rhino as a one-horned horse. There's linguistic evidence for this idea. 400 years ago, it was believed that there were two types of rhinos. Ones with two horns were called rhinoceros, and ones with a single horn were called unicorns. So the word unicorn was used to describe both real rhinos and the mythical one-horned horse. It wasn't until zoology advanced as a science that unicorn came to refer purely to the mythical creature. There are still remnants of the original usage, though. The genus of scientific name for Asian rhinos, which have one horn, is unicorns. Story 5. Archaeologist here. There's a really interesting ancient Egyptian story called The Shipwrecked Sailor, in which a man has washed ashore on a beautiful island and is apprehended briefly by an enormous serpent. In the story, the serpent tells him that there used to be hundreds of others like him, but a falling star wiped them all out. I think it's unlikely that the Egyptians had knowledge of dinosaurs, but there's a site called Wadi Haiten that has thousands of ancient whale skeletons from the Eocene. I think it's possible they could have seen these skeletons and mistaken them for giant snakes. Herodotus actually tells similar tales of giant flying snakes in Egypt, and I suppose if you saw these skeletons but no trails, you might think they were capable of flight. Story 6. I believe that Bigfoot probably does exist, or at least did until very recently, but I doubt that it was a unique species. My theory is that what people see is a mundane animal, probably a large brown bear with serious genetic deformities. Encountering a 7-foot bear with mange, maybe a deformed cranium, possible scars from fights with other bears, and other such traits would certainly trigger a fight-or-flight response. You see something like that, you haul ass in the other direction. When you stop, you're not 100% certain of what you saw, so your brain fills in the details. So you take a deformed animal and mix it with an imaginative mind that knows what the popular version of Bigfoot looks like, and you get a bona fide Bigfoot sighting. I forgot to mention, but I'm pretty sure that the entire concept of Bigfoot can trace its origins directly to Gigantopithecus. Without Gigantopithecus, there probably wouldn't be Bigfoot. But on the other hand, who can say that the story didn't come from some other source? Perhaps ancient people saw a bear like I described and embellished the tale. Either way, I'm convinced that most, if not all, Bigfoot sightings that aren't outright hoaxes are just people seeing a mundane animal, and their brain interprets it as something else. Happens all the time with things that aren't mysterious cryptids. Story 7. The banshee was never real, but lots of Irish parents came up with a story about a screaming woman that kept their kids terrified and in their beds. The banshee's woeful wail meant kids had to stay in bed or get stolen away. The story was told so that parents in question could have sex. Loud sex. Because the kids would have heard their mom's amorous moans and interpreted them as a ghostly call from beyond the grave. Story 8. Arthur. From the legendary people's side of things, King Arthur was certainly someone who actually existed, albeit in a much different form than modern audiences would be familiar with. The earliest mentions of him are as a historic British king who lived during the 5th century. He's in a king's list, is mentioned as winning a series of decisive battles against the Saxons, and his excellent swordsmanship is referenced once, and that's about it. During the Middle Ages, Arthur's tale was romanticized and then conflated with some other myths and folklore. Several of his knights, such as Lancelot, were originally heroes of their own legends before being added to his, until we finally ended up with our present version that has all the medieval knights and magic and the Round Table and the Holy Grail business. It's entirely possible that the name of Arthur itself was part of this later conflation, as his victories against the Saxons were also credited in some sources to a general named Ambrosius Aurelianus. Those sources may be wrong, or they may have been two different leaders who were mistakenly combined by later writers, a king and his general perhaps. Among historians who support Arthur's historicity, the thinking goes that he was a Romano-British, i.e. Welsh, leader who fought against Saxon incursions and held them off during his lifetime, becoming ruler of part of Britain in the wake of Rome's withdrawal. His name would have originally been Roman Artorius, which became Arthurus in the Vulgar Latin and was later shifted to Arthur by Celtic influence in the 6th century. Troy. The Trojan War is another legendary event that was certainly based on something real. We know Troy was a real city that was actually raised around 1190 BC, and we have a lot of evidence that says the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite Empire fought several conflicts over the city, which was a powerful city-state and vassal of the Hittites at the time. The Trojan War from the Iliad is either a legendary account of the most glorious Mycenaean victory in these wars, or perhaps a dramatization of the entire series of wars distilled into one mythical conflict. As for the people mentioned in the stories though, no telling. Many were likely based on actual nobles from the conflicts, but Greek mythos has a habit of adding later heroes to famous stories. Combined with a massive time gap before we inherit our earliest surviving copy of the story, at least some of the characters were probably added later. Serious scholarship tries to identify which parts of the Iliad are most guilty of this, and which parts most resemble its Bronze Age origins. My favorite thinking from the historicity debate on Troy is that the whole Helen situation was originally understood to be a metaphor for the actual transgression that the Trojans committed. Hittite letters suggest that they were the aggressors, but don't specify how. So we're left guessing about what sort of treaty violations or trade disputes Helen might have been meant to represent. Story 9. Alright, as a historian, giants. They exist in some form over many cultures and history. My favorite story is about a Native American tribe that told the story of the giants that killed them to near extinction generations upon generations ago, and how they were a horrible beast and quite large, all the characteristics of a giant. Truth be told, and this is probably true of most legends and accounts of giants, that it's just a height relative thing. A majority of the population was quite small back in the day. Besides being easier to hide and run, less body mass meant less food needed and more chances of survival. But I digress. People were quite small, like average 5-footers and less. Anyone who was taller was probably considered a giant. The whole tribe as giant people, 5'10" and above, must have been especially terrifying when they were a warring tribe or just in conflict with you. So the generational story was just about a smaller height-wise tribe that encountered a taller height-wise tribe, and they fought. The story of the giants. The natives have a lot of stories of supernatural creatures that were just odd to them humans. The pale-faced beasts were probably Vikings. Vikings caused a whole migration of a tribe as well. It's really interesting in my field of work to just put things in perspective. You gain so much. Story 10. Environmental scientist here to mention stellar sea ape. Stellar is a highly respected name in botany, zoology, etc. To this day, responsible for naming and or discovering a lot of charismatic Russians and Alaskan creatures such as stellar sea cow, stellar sea lion, sea otters, and many more. Everything he described was fully legitimate, and confirmed despite concerns that he was making things up. If I recall correctly, people did not believe in a sea cow so large and docile as he described, or in otters at sea with thicker fur. There's only one exception, that being the sea ape. This was a creature that had reported to be smaller than the men on the ship, furred and ape-like, which swam around his ship in an almost mocking fashion, supposedly juggling and playing with kelp before dodging every bullet the crew shot at it and swimming off. Many different ideas exist as to what this actually was. Some think Stellar was mocking the captain of the ship who he had a contentious relationship with, referring to him as an ape of the sea, while others think that this may actually have been an edit put into Stellar's original works by a rival scientist. However, others still think that this may have been a real observed incident with a malformed sea lion. Personally, from what I've read, I think there's a decent chance that the sea ape was a unique animal, not an ape, but either a specific species or subspecies of otter, or other marine or semi-aquatic mammal. Sea mink were likely still alive on the opposite coast of the states at the time of this reported sighting. Who's to say that a larger, similar animal couldn't have also frolicked through the waters of Alaska? As for the juggling, I am no expert in German, but I know his original manuscripts were translated and then back-translated before their initial publication, when the potential rivals could have inserted this story to harm his credibility. But my guess is the term for tossing around playfully and juggling are similar, that the kelp may not have been actually tossed like a circus performance, but rather spun around in the water playfully. Regardless, it doesn't really make sense to me that one of the most respected names in science, known specifically for not telling the tall tales that his colleagues often did, would invent such a creature just to mock a coworker or gain fame. I don't think this was really an ape, but I totally buy its existence. Quick mini one with way less evidence by its nature, but it's hard to discuss Stellar's sea ape without also mentioning the aquatic ape hypothesis, the idea that humans were the failed evolutionary experiment of a marine mammal ape. This purports to explain why our noses are more telescoped than the other species of ape, why we lost so much of our body hair, why we have more webbing between digits and various other commonalities seen in the evolutionary history of marine mammals. There is no way to test this hypothesis, but it's a fun thought to entertain. Story 11. Published Archaeologist here. All over the world, from Siberia to Australia, the Himalayas to Ohio, mankind has told stories of tall bipedal apes that live in the forests. The First Nations of the Pacific Northwest call them the Sasquatch. The Nepalese call them Yeti, but today most people refer to them as Bigfoot. There was an entire line of humanoids called the robust Australopithecines that evolved right alongside us. They were about 9 feet tall, extremely muscular, hairy, omnivorous, and importantly lacked the big brain that we got. Because they mostly fed on things like roots, they were most likely arboreal upright apes that had insane jaw muscles, which required an anchor point in their skull called the sagittal crest. This is what separates our branch of the human family from theirs. While we lack the crest and have comparatively weak jaw muscles, we gain the power of speech and abstract thought while our robust cousins got by on brute force alone. Many sightings of Bigfoot often report a domed head, hinting towards the identity of the beast. Their fossils are exceedingly rare. As a matter of fact, all human fossils are rare, especially the really old ones. Nevertheless, the youngest robust Australopithecine fossil is dated to roughly 100,000 years ago. It is entirely possible that they survived long after that. As previously stated, the fossilization process is extremely difficult, and some species pass into the dark without ever leaving a fossilized trace of their existence. If the last ones died out sometime around 11,000 years ago, which marked the young dryas extinction event, they would have been around during the peopling of the world, solidifying their place in many cultures' mythology. Is it possible that they're still around today? There is a worldwide environmental collapse culminating in a mass extinction the likes of which the world has not seen for 65 million years. Species are dying out at an exponential rate, and habitats are being annihilated for human habitation. If they have not yet gone extinct, they will be within our lifetime. Story 12. All the mythology that comes out of my home country is mainly about dragons, and it makes me smile. Below is a story about how the dragon ended up on our flag. I'm from Wales, by the way. Way back in the 5th century, the Celtic king Vortigern chose Dinas Imris as the site for his castle. From here, he hoped to escape the Saxons, but his plans for a fortress weren't easily achieved. Every night, the royal masons would lay down their tools only to return the next day to find they'd vanished, and their carefully crafted walls had fallen down. And so it went on, day after day, until Vortigern was forced to seek the help of sorcerers and magicians. They advised that the ground should be sprinkled with the blood of a child born to a human mother and a father from the other world. Merlin and the Dragon's Lair. A search was launched, and eventually the child was found in Caer Myrddin, and preparations for the sacrifice were made. But the child, Myrddin Emrys, was no ordinary child. In fact, he was Merlin the Wizard. Merlin convinced Vortigern that 2 dragons lay sleeping under a lake inside the mountain, and it was they that were destroying the foundations of his fortress. Convinced the boy was right, Vortigern commanded his laborers to dig deep into the mountain. They did as they were told, and discovered an underground lake, just as Merlin had predicted. Once drained, the red and white dragons that lay sleeping there awoke and began to fight. Battle of 2 dragons. Eventually, the white dragon fled, and the red dragon returned quietly to his lair. Vortigern's castle was finally built and duly named Dinas Imris in honor of Myrtin Imris, and the Red Dragon has been celebrated ever since. Not convinced? In 1945, the site was excavated by archaeologists who discovered a lake in the ruins of the fortress dating to Vortigern's time. The walls all showed signs of having been rebuilt several times. Story 13. In my hometown, the old Native Americans, including my grandfather, tell the story of a thing they called the Char. As far as I know, it's just a local thing. But every story is about a man that would hide in abandoned houses in the outskirts of my small town, and would lure kids into the houses just to tie them up and burn the houses down. Anyway, Char eventually burned himself horrifically, and instead of letting him die, his heart felt guilty and made him live forever as a hideous freak, and supposedly he still haunts our town. Every so many years, he comes back into town and burns something down. Now normally I would never believe such an outlandish story, but there are a lot of old police reports of a mentally sick man that would hurt kids around the area after the state mental hospital shut down in the late 50s and early 60s. He was eventually found dead, so it seems like Char was a story to keep your kids safe. The scary part is, there is a consistent pattern of fires in this town. My childhood best friend and his grandmother burned to death in 2006, and just last year there was a string of fires, but before that there were dozens of fires that started well before the 60s. Story 14. I think Atlantis probably existed. There was evidence of ancient cities buried underwater like Dwarka in the Gulf of Cambay, Cleopatra's Palace in Alexandria, and Lion City in Kianado Lake. Almost centuries ago, people wouldn't have thought ancient ruins of cities existed underwater. But as time went on and we developed the technology to navigate the depths of our oceans and the rest of Earth's waters, we've ended up proving them wrong by discovering these ruins that was supposedly lost in time years before. Furthermore, while we have the technology to walk on the moon, we've barely even touched on more than 5% of our oceans. 95% of our oceans are still very much undiscovered, at least until we continue to develop the technology necessary to explore them. And given a very big chunk of our ocean is yet to be explored, there is a possibility we'll be able to find not only new and or rediscovered marine life that was thought to either not exist or to has been extinct, but possibly pick up sunken artifacts and have the capability to reach undiscovered ruins that unfortunately sunk into our waters eons ago that was unreachable to us before. It has happened before, and I think it'll happen again. So the chances that Atlantis probably existed are there, although rather slim. If anything, it's either one of those underwater cities that hasn't been discovered as of yet, even if the legend of it lived on, or a mislabeling of a city that did end up buried underwater. The chance is there, but relatively slim. Story 15. I haven't seen it here yet, so I'll mention Leviathan. The Bible mentions a beast, and lists a number of traits, and if we consider that we haven't found in nature anything that breathes fire and allows that one trait alone to be a storytelling embellishment, then the rest of it, a creature with scales that can turn aside a spear, unfearing of arrows, and most telling of all, jaws like a hinged jaw that could swallow a man whole, people being a little smaller in the times of malnutrition. We could be looking at a very fair and accurate description of a Nile crocodile. I also concur with a unicorn equals poorly described rhino theory. Similarly in line with this one, a real creature that was somewhat embellished in telling. I saw a video claiming that although there are no chimeric beasts, platypus are close but have a genus, chimeric beasts are fusions of multiple evolved forms. The biggest predators we had to worry about, especially in our species' evolutionary history, were the snake, the hunting raptor or flying predatory birds, and the lion.